Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today we're talking about part 3 of the Disturbing Books Iceberg. In this video, I'll be talking about another 6 books from each layer of the iceberg, starting with the tamer and more well-known stuff at the top, and getting to the more depraved and obscure novels at the bottom. When I do these iceberg videos, I try to go into a little bit more detail than you typically see in other iceberg videos, so there will be spoilers for a lot of these novels. It won't be all of them, and I will give you a warning before I'm about to fully spoil the story of a couple of these novels. So if a novel on this iceberg sounds interesting to you and you don't want to have it spoiled, then go ahead and skip past that section. But like I said, I will be giving a verbal warning every time I do spoil something, so you shouldn't have to worry about getting caught by surprise. Also, please remember to like and subscribe. My goal is to hit 10,000 subs by the end of 2025, and I really do think I can get there. I just need your guys' help, obviously. I also offer channel memberships that get you early access to videos like this one, and also a monthly exclusive video, and a little shout out at the end of all my videos. So if you feel like supporting me in that way, there's a link in the description of this video where you can support me for either $3 or $5 a month. If you haven't seen the first 2 parts of this series, then I would recommend watching those first, but it's not required to enjoy this video by any means. Like I said before, I will be covering 6 books from each layer, so it's not like this one will have more intense stuff than layer 1 did. But that's enough preamble, so without further ado, let's get into part 3 of the Disturbing Books Iceberg. Level 1. 1984 is a book that a lot of people like to reference, but very few people seem to actually have read. It's an early dystopian novel published in 1959 by George Orwell that explores a future British society in a world ravaged by war. The book follows Winston Smith, a worker at the government Ministry of Truth, who is tasked with rewriting historical documents to fit into the narrative that the government wants. This government is ruled by a figure known as Big Brother, who is practically worshipped. The ruling party purges anybody who doesn't align with their ideals and introduces the idea of being a thought criminal, which is just to say somebody who disagrees with what the party wants. The party's objective is just complete and total power for the sake of power itself. I don't want to spoil this book for you if you haven't read it, and I don't find it particularly disturbing, but there are some torture sequences later in the novel that could be distressing. I think this is a book that everybody should read, especially in the context with which it was written. Orwell was a democratic socialist who firmly opposed the authoritarian socialism of Nazi Germany, and this book sought to illustrate the natural end to racial, societal, and social philosophies held by both the Nazis and the Soviet Union. The Turn of the Screw is an 1898 Gothic horror novella written by Henry James about a governess who is sent to take care of 2 children named Flora and Miles at an estate in Bly. If that sounds familiar to you, then you've probably seen the Netflix show The Haunting of Bly Manor. As far as novellas go, this one's pretty tame in my opinion. It definitely has that gothic horror vibe that is a little unsettling, and it does deal with bad stuff happening to children, so I assume that's why it's on the list. This is another one that I've read and I would recommend it. It can be a little confusing given that it was written over 100 years ago, but I think these old horror stories are really fun. I would also highly recommend watching the Netflix shows about those, since those miniseries are some of my favorite shows of all time. Speaking of which, The Haunting of Hill House is another old gothic horror novella, this time written by Shirley Jackson, who is one of the most prolific horror writers of all time. She is absolutely amazing. This novella tells the story of a paranormal investigation of the infamous Hill House led by a Dr. John Montague. The doctor invites people to the house that have had experiences with the paranormal, which is how we get our lead Eleanor to enter the story. The book isn't what I would call disturbing, but there are definitely some distressing elements to it, and it did creep me out a little bit when I read it. There are a lot of shades of the yellow wallpaper near the end of the story, and Hill House itself, like the building, is an endlessly fascinating mystery that we don't get many answers to. I think this makes the book even more interesting, and the ending is one that could definitely disturb some readers. This book was also turned into a loose adaptation by Mike Flanagan for Netflix, and I would also highly recommend that show if you haven't watched it yet. It's an interesting use of the source material, and there are plenty of Easter eggs and callbacks to the novel, so it's really fun if you've read the novel before. I see The Haunting of Hill House as kind of the quintessential gothic horror book, so if you're interested in that genre, then I would definitely give it a read. Again, it's not super disturbing, but it will definitely have you wondering what is going on in the house and why it seems to be so haunted. Frankenstein is often regarded as the first horror novel ever written. It was written by Mary Shelley in the early 1800s and was first published in 1818. It's the story of Dr. Frankenstein and his monster that he creates by piecing together bits of animals and dead bodies. Frankenstein is able to bring the creature to life, but upon realizing how horrifying it looks, he flees, and the rest of the book follows both Dr. Frankenstein and the creature as they live their lives and try to understand their places in the world. The creature feels that he's been cursed from the beginning given his horrifying form, and learns to hate the Doctor for creating him to be so hideous. It's honestly a really tragic story about a creature that wants to be accepted by a world around him, but he's only ever seen as a monster. The creature feels that he was cursed from the beginning, given his horrifying looks, and he learns to hate the Doctor for creating him to be so hideous. It's honestly a tragic story about a creature that wants to be accepted by the world around him, but is only ever seen as a monster. The entire novel is deeply tragic, with nobody really ending up better than the way they started. There are definitely some disturbing elements to it, but it's surprisingly psychological in its horror, which is impressive for being the start of the horror novel genre. Wendigoon has a really great video about the story of Frankenstein that I would suggest you watch if you haven't already. It covers the book really well, and it's one of my favorite videos of his. I'd also recommend reading the book if you're interested in horror history. It's a really impressive book, especially that it was given by an 18-year-old in a literature landscape where horror stories were pretty much unheard of. Flowers for Algernon is a book that messed me up. I don't know if I would really call it disturbing, but it's deeply sad, and it really affected me in a way that I didn't expect it would. It's a novel written by Daniel Keyes and is about a man named Charlie who is developmentally delayed and has an IQ of 68. He works a menial job as a baker, but is given the opportunity to undergo a procedure that will boost his intelligence. He goes through with it and becomes rapidly smart to the point where those around him feel alienated by his intelligence. It's a book about a man who just wants to be happy, but he starts to see that his new intelligence is causing some things in his life to get worse. The book is brilliant as well, as the writing style changes as Charlie's intelligence grows. The book starts out with words being misspelled and the grammar reflecting the way that Charlie thinks and speaks, but then as he gets smarter, the writing reflects that and becomes what you'd expect of any professionally published novel. I don't think I would call the book disturbing, but I would call it profoundly sad. The idea that your pursuit of self-improvement would lead to resentment by those around you or those that you thought were your friends is really depressing, and the book deals with a lot of failed relationships and even some child abuse at one point. Despite me saying this book is really depressing, I would actually recommend it. If not the full novel, then at least the short story that was written first. I can't quite put into words what makes this book so sad to me, but if you read it, you'll probably understand what I'm saying. Coraline is a 2002 British dark fantasy horror children's novella. A lot of words there, written by Neil Gaiman. And it's also one of my favorite books and movies of all time. The book tells the story of Coraline Jones, a young woman who moves into an old house with her parents that has been divided into 3 separate apartments. She discovers a locked door in the living room that has been bricked up, but is able to enter the door at night, leading to a strange alternate reality. In this world, she is met with her other mother, a woman who looks like her mother, but the proportions are slightly off and she has buttons for eyes. The rest of the book tells of Coraline attempting to save her family from the sinister other mother. The book is definitely very creepy, and it has one scene in particular in the basement of the house with the other father that really stuck with me. There's also a lot of bug and spider imagery in the book, so if you don't like that, then this book will definitely get to you. I think this book is on the iceberg because it's definitely marketed as a children's book, but it also has a lot of creepy horror elements to it. I really love children's horror, so this will definitely be one book that my future children will read. It was also made into a stop-motion animated film that is honestly just about perfect. It's my favorite animated movie of all time, and I love pretty much everything about it. It's also one of the rare adaptations that I feel is better than its source material. The movie changes a couple aspects of the story, like the story taking place in Oregon rather than Britain, and the addition of some new characters to kind of stretch out the story to a feature length. The book is really short, and I would highly recommend it to anybody, regardless of age. Level 2. Battle Royale is a Japanese dystopian horror novel written by Koushin Takami and first published in 1999. The book takes place in a dystopian, fascist Japan in which the government controls everything, headed by an unnamed dictator with a massive cult of personality surrounding him. The government bans any sort of art or music that doesn't glorify the dictator, and the military sets up an experimental program where 50 randomly selected classes are chosen to participate. The students are kidnapped, dropped into a remote location, and forced to kill each other until only a single student remains. I won't spoil the story to this one because the book is a really great read and it has heavily influenced pop culture, the most obvious example being The Hunger Games, which takes a very similar premise and changes a couple elements to it. There are definitely a lot of disturbing aspects to this novel, as it is a story about a bunch of young teenagers killing each other. None of the depictions of the violence are overly graphic, I would say. It still feels more intense than something like The Hunger Games though, so if you're interested in a similar story, just a bit heavier, then I would check this out. The book also has a film adaptation that I really enjoyed. It's dated and was low budget, but I really love that movie, and I found it to be a lot of fun and significantly bleaker than most dystopian movies that we get today. The dystopian genre in general has kind of morphed into a young adult or teen genre since the rise of The Hunger Games, so I love reading these older novels because they never pulled their punches, and I think that makes them a whole lot more effective. The Hunchback of Notre Dame is an 1831 novel written by the legendary author Victor Hugo, and let me tell you, this book is kind of messed up. I don't know what psychopath read this and thought it would make a good Disney musical. They were right, but the book is also really morbid, Full spoilers ahead. The story takes place in Paris in the year 1482, and pretty much everything in the story revolves around Esmeralda, a 16-year-old Romani dancer that literally everyone in this book is trying to sleep with at all times. There is not a single person that is not in love with this woman. One of the people that is in love with her is Quasimodo, a hunchbacked bell ringer that lives in the cathedral with his abusive guardian, Archdeacon Claude Frollo. Frollo forces Quasimodo to stay inside and out of sight of the public and teaches him to hate his own physical appearance. Despite Frollo being the archdeacon and being celibate, he also falls in love with Esmeralda and orders Quasimodo to kidnap her. While trying to do so though, Quasimodo is captured by the captain of the guard, Phoebus, and Esmeralda then falls in love with Phoebus since Phoebus is the one that saved her. The next day, the town publicly tortures and humiliates Quasimodo, and at one point he calls out for water and Esmeralda shows him some mercy and gives him some, and this just causes him to fall even more in love with her. Again, literally everybody wants to get with Esmeralda. Eventually, Frollo finds out that Esmeralda is in love with Phoebus, and he stalks the two of them to a boarding house where he hears Esmeralda trying to get Phoebus to marry her. He doesn't want to commit, however, and the two just end up sleeping together. Frollo, ever the charmer, gets so mad at this that he bursts into the room and stabs Phoebus, and then thinking that he is dead and Esmeralda kills him, she is arrested by the police and charged with murder and witchcraft. She is then brutally tortured in what is probably the most brutal scene in the book, so she falsely confesses to the murder and is taken to be hanged. Quasimodo then swings down like Tarzan from the cathedral and saves her as she's about to be hanged, and then the two of them stay in the cathedral under the law of sanctuary, meaning she cannot be pursued by the police as long as she remains at the cathedral. While staying at the cathedral, Frollo sneaks into Esmeralda's room and attempts to sexually assault her, but he is beaten by Quasimodo, who almost throws him off the cathedral to his death. The Romani people then grow outraged that Esmeralda is being held captive in the cathedral and attempt to break in and rescue her. Quasimodo fights them off, thinking they are there to arrest and kill her. And then the police show up to look for Esmeralda, but she's already been taken by Frollo. And then he attempts to seduce her one last time, but she refuses his advances. So he goes to alert the police and leaves her with a very racist lady who hates the Romani people because she thinks they killed and ate her infant daughter. We end up finding out that the racist lady is actually Esmeralda's birth mother, and the two have a wonderful reunion before the police shows up to escort Esmeralda to the gallows. Her mother clings to her and she won't let go, so the captain of the police literally takes her mother and throws her to the ground so hard that she dies on impact. Esmeralda is then hanged and killed. Quasimodo and Frollo watch from the roof of the cathedral, and in his rage, Quasimodo kills Frollo by throwing him off the roof to his death. So yeah, literally nothing positive comes from the story. It's just kind of depressing. And maybe the weirdest part to me, and I know I'm probably just being dramatic and that it's not supposed to be as weird as it is, but at the end of the novel, it says that in the crypt where Esmeralda's skeleton was found, she was found cradled by the skeleton of a deformed man. So that means that Quasimodo crawled into her crypt after she was dead and cradled her dead, decaying corpse until he died himself. And keep in mind that she was never interested in him romantically. They were kind of friends and that was it. So yeah, it's kind of a book about incels. What more can I say? I will say that the book is very well written and considered one of the greatest works of French literature. It's not too disturbing, but definitely has a lot of creepy dudes hitting on a 16-year-old girl, and Frollo is the ultimate creep, so I can see why it's on this list. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a novel written by Ken Kesey and published in 1962. It tells the story of a group of patients at a mental hospital in Oregon, and like I always say, I'm a Pacific Northwest resident, so I always love to see the representation. I'll give you a spoiler-free summary of this before I go into the story with full spoilers, because I love this novel and I think pretty much everybody should read it. The story is told from the point of view of a character named Chief Bromden, who is a patient at a mental institution. The institution is run by a controlling and often cruel nurse named Miss Ratched, who rules the institution with an iron fist. At the beginning of the novel, a new patient arrives named R.P. McMurphy, who faked insanity to serve his sentence for battery at the mental hospital instead of prison. The book explores the power struggle between McMurphy and Ratched and is really, really good. I wouldn't call it too disturbing beyond a couple instances of sexual assault and also some medical injuries. And seriously read it if you haven't read it, and if you don't want to, then I'm going to spoil the entire story now. Ready? So the narrator, Chief Bromden, is a paranoid mute who thinks that everything in the institution is being controlled by machinery and that everything is made up of kind of these living machines that grow and shrink in size depending on how scared he is at any given moment. This makes the writing style of the novel very unique, and it's one of the reasons that I love it so much. McMurphy shows up and quickly starts to cause chaos. He has a violent history, but he's generally very friendly to everyone around him. He befriends all of the members of the asylum and brings them all out of their shells, but this upsets Miss Ratched, who is unable to control McMurphy. McMurphy tries to to get the men to revolt and eventually escape the asylum. They find an old, giant mechanical console in the hallway, and McMurphy tries to lift it and throw it through the window to break the glass, but the console is like immensely heavy and he can't even get it to budge. He organizes a fishing trip with the men, and they are supervised by two family friends of McMurphy who are actually just hired sex workers. They steal a boat on the fishing trip, but everybody has a good time and it seems to be a mostly positive experience. Miss Ratched is angry when the men return, and she sends both the chief and McMurphy to receive violent electroshock treatment that does nothing to alter their temperaments. This is probably one of, if not the most disturbing scenes in the book, at least to me. And then during the trip, one of the patients named Billy reveals that he has a crush on one of the sex workers. Billy is a timid man with a stutter who seems to be deathly afraid of his own mother. He is also just kind of a paranoid guy. McMurphy then sneaks the sex workers into the asylum so Billy can lose his virginity and the rest can throw a party. The sex workers stay overnight, but none of the patients clean up their mess. Miss Ratched discovers them the next morning and angrily chastises the group. Billy stands up to her, yelling at her, and for once his stutter is nowhere to be found and he has regained his confidence, seemingly curing the condition that he was first admitted for. Ratched then responds by telling Billy that his mother would be furious, which sends Billy into a paranoid rage. She leaves him alone in the doctor's office and he kills himself by cutting his own throat. And then outraged by this, McMurphy snaps and attacks and then sexually assaults Miss Ratched. He tries to strangle and kill her, but he's pulled away by the orderlies. Miss Ratched orders McMurphy to be lobotomized, which leaves him in a vegetative state. The chief is horrified at this, as McMurphy had become his closest friend, and in an act of mercy, he suffocates him with a pillow. He then picks up that large console in the hallway and shatters the window, escaping the institution. Like I said, this book is phenomenal. It's not too disturbing, although I should point out that the orderlies in the institution are heavily implied to be sexually assaulting the patients. This is probably the most disturbing aspect of it, as it's described by the chief, who kind of has a childlike brain and can't fully comprehend what's happening. The book is also interesting because I don't think the moral of the story is that McMurphy was right. He did a lot of things to the men that did harm to them, and he was also a violent person who probably could have used real help. The book is supposed to show us that militant control and violent treatment of the mentally ill solves no issues. All of the patients at the asylum needed help, but none of them were given the help that they needed. They were locked away and victimized by a cruel woman. This book is meant to serve as an advocate for the humane treatment of the mentally ill, so seriously go read it. I love this novel. The Painted Bird is a 1965 novel written by Jerzy Kosinski that follows a young boy living in Central Europe during World War II. His parents have abandoned him and the boy is often mistaken as being Jewish and is treated harshly because of this. This book is a significant step up from what we've talked about so far. Pretty much everything bad that could happen to someone happens to this boy. I'm going to talk about a couple things, but I can't even cover all of them without this video being like an extra hour long, so some very mild spoilers ahead. We have a lot of sexual and physical assault, and at one point our main character, again, who is a 6-year-old boy, is buried up to his neck in dirt by a woman, and then he is attacked by ravenous birds. There's also a woman who constantly exposes herself to a neighborhood boy. Her husband mercilessly beats her and then gouges out the eyes of the young boy. There's also a lot of animal abuse in this book, which is pretty difficult for me to handle for some reason, but easily the worst thing that happens is that we learn of a woman who is brutally assaulted sexually by a group of men, leaving her mentally scarred. She attempts to sexually assault the main character, and in retaliation, she is brutally attacked and molested by all the men of the village. Afterwards, she is beaten to death by the jealous wives of all the men. It's really brutal and hard to get through. So yeah, this one is pretty intense and definitely our first really disturbing novel of this video, in my opinion. If you're looking for a book that never lets up on terrible things happening to everyone in the story, I would give this a read. A Little Life is a 2015 novel written by Hanya Yanagihara, and I can probably tell that this will be my most controversial take in this video because I really disliked this book. I know a lot of people love it, but it just feels like pure misery, and the author of the book kind of props up this idea in some of her interviews that some people are destined to never find happiness and that them ending their own lives is the only way to solve that issue. This seriously isn't true, like, at all. I don't think the author had bad intentions with that statement, but seriously, I promise you that anything you're dealing with is something that you can overcome so long as you have access to good people around you and professional help and, you know, good resources. This book technically follows the lives of 4 separate characters, but it really only mostly focuses on a character named Jude. He lives a miserable life where he is never happy, and anytime anything remotely good happens to him, it's immediately taken away. He's the victim of a lot of sexual assault, human trafficking, physical violence, and self-harm and mutilation. I won't spoil this book for you if you're interested in reading it. It is brutal and it doesn't pull its punches, And it's also not interested in being inspirational at all. We are just kind of meant to watch Jude suffer and speculate as to when he will end his own life. The YouTube channel Man Caring Thing has a really great video on this book. At least I think it's great, but I also agreed with him on almost everything he says about the book. If you like this book, then seriously, no hate towards you at all. I think it's really well written, but I must just be kind of missing something because this is one that I didn't really enjoy, and I tend to like miserable books. Ring is a 1991 Japanese horror mystery novel written by Koji Suzuki that follows a reporter investigating a series of deaths that seem to have been caused by the viewing of a haunted videotape. It was made into an American movie called The Ring that you've probably at least heard of. I have a full video about this book up on my channel right now that goes fully into the plot and gives some of my own personal thoughts and analysis on this book. Please go check that video out if this sounds interesting to you. There are quite a few differences between the novel and the American remake, so even if you've seen that movie, you'll still like my video. Because of that, I'm going to defer to that video instead of doing a recap here. It isn't really that disturbing. There is some murder and sexual assault, but nothing too graphic or gruesome. It is a really fun read though, and it's kind of an iconic horror novel. Level 3. On the Beach is a 1957 apocalyptic horror novel written by Neville Shute that explores the state of the world after a mass nuclear war has ravaged the planet. The idea of that alone is really disturbing to me, as that is something that could conceivably happen. The novel follows a number of characters, most of them living in Australia, as the entire northern hemisphere has become uninhabitable due to the fallout of the nuclear weapons used during the war. A transmission is picked up from off the coast of Seattle, which causes people to believe that there may be some hope of rebuilding civilization. Most of the disturbing content in this novel comes from the sheer hopelessness of the situation that these people are in. The Australian government has also issued free suicide pills and injections for people to take so they don't have to suffer the effects of the radiation. We have a man who desperately tries to convince his wife to kill both herself and their infant daughter. It's a very bleak novel, but it actually seems like a good read. There's an actual objectives that the characters in the story have, and a mystery to be solved with a radio broadcast, so it's not totally miserable for the sake of being miserable. If you like books or movies about nuclear war or the fallout of nuclear war, then this would definitely be one to check out. I am personally terrified of radiation and have been even more so terrified after watching Chernobyl on HBO, which you should watch if you haven't. It's amazing. Also, I feel like I've been giving props to a lot of books and TV shows in this. I'm not sponsored by anybody. My channel's not that big, so that's not that. I just really like this stuff. Girl Interrupted is a 1993 memoir by Susanna Kaysen that details her experiences as a young woman in a psychiatric hospital in the 1960s after having been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. This book shares a lot of DNA with The Bell Jar, which we covered in the last part of this iceberg. The disturbing elements of this book come from the paranoia of the author and how she relates her mental state at the time. The book is written incredibly well, and the choppy, disorganized thoughts of the narrator are fully realized through a really unique writing style. Nothing too shocking or violent happens in the book beyond an incident where a main character chews through her own hand because she grows terrified that she has lost her bones. There are also several mentions or instances of suicide and self-harm, so that can be pretty difficult on some readers. This is another one of the novels on this list that I could reasonably recommend to someone without them never speaking to me again. It's sad and upsetting, but there is a happy ending of sorts to be found, given that it's the true story of the author who went on to have a successful career. I'd love to know how this book reads to somebody who has borderline personality disorder. I'm curious to see whether the author's experience was universal or if what she was suffering from was completely different. A big plot point of the book is that she might not even have BPD. If you have borderline personality disorder and have read this book and feel comfortable sharing your thoughts, then I would love to hear them. You can put them in the comments or email me at the email in my channel description if you're not comfortable putting that in the comments. No pressure though, I'm just kind of curious. Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter is a novel that I was unfortunately not able to find a ton of information on besides some user reviews and the first couple chapters that I read. The book is about two adult sisters whose other third sister disappeared when she was a teenager. The book opens with an intense kidnapping, and the rest of the book contains a lot of violence, sexual assault, and torture, and all of it's described in harrowing detail. Karen Slaughter is known for writing absolutely brutal books, and this one is no exception, it seems. Her novels are well regarded in the intense literature scene, and just from the couple of chapters that I read, this looks like a book that I would really enjoy. The writing style is smooth and easy to read despite the haunting subject matter. There is as little literary friction between the reader and the horrifying events, which makes it feel more visceral in my opinion, if that makes sense. So I definitely check this one out if you like mysteries and can handle some of the more intense themes of this novel, especially the sexual assault, which I know can be difficult for a lot of people. Sorry I couldn't find much more about this novel. If you've read it, then please let me know what you thought in the comments. Requiem for a Dream is a 1978 novel written by Hubert Selby Jr. that follows the lives of four people people from New York as they sink further and further into drug addiction. This is another novel that is probably more well known for its film adaptation, which is absolutely phenomenal, but it's a very difficult watch, at least it was for me. I'll be doing a more detailed description of this novel, so spoilers ahead. I also would recommend this novel even if you've seen the movie. The writing style can be kind of off-putting at first since there's a lot of like slang and idioms used in the writing, and it can feel like you're reading a different language at times, but once you get used to it, it's not so bad and kind of cool. The story of the novel follows Sarah, her son Harry, his girlfriend Marion, and his best friend Tyrone. All of the characters are looking to accomplish a certain dream that they have, and they all start the novel as kind of these optimists that think they can rise above their circumstances and accomplish the life that they've always dreamed of. Harry and Marion are deeply in love with each other and want to start up their own business, and Tyrone just wants to get out of the ghetto and make a name for himself. They decide to try to get rich by buying a large amount of heroin and flipping it by selling it to other people. To be honest, this isn't the greatest start to their dream life. Sarah, again, who is the mother, has always dreamed of being on television. She gets a call from a game show casting company and assumes that she has the part, and then wanting to look good on TV, she goes to a doctor who gives her diet pills that she takes for the next couple of months. The casting company never calls her back, and it appears that she never even got the part in the first place, but she has become addicted to the pills which contain amphetamines. Her repeated abuse of the pills gives her amphetamine psychosis, which is a condition caused typically by the abuse of amphetamines that causes neurotic, psychotic delusions. And I do want to say that while amphetamines as diet pills are definitely not something that is done today, at least not from a doctor, amphetamines are still regularly prescribed. I personally have ADHD and I take a medication that is an amphetamine. I imagine that if you heavily abuse those medications though, you'd have to abuse them pretty hard to trigger amphetamine psychosis. I've never had that. But anyways, Sarah's psychosis grows so bad that she is sent to a mental institution where she has to receive painful electroshock treatments, and she ends up as a shell of the woman she once was. Meanwhile, Harry, Marion, and Tyrone all grow addicted to their own stash of heroin and end up shooting it all up instead of selling it. As they grow more addicted, they start to turn on each other and hide drugs away in their own personal stashes. Harry and Tyrone are arrested and convicted. They're sentenced to prison. The book ends with Harry and Tyrone in prison. Harry's arm has become completely necrotic and infected due to repeat injections of the heroin, and it has to be painfully amputated. Tyrone suffers from withdrawal in prison and is abused by the prison guards due to his race. Marion is the only member who is still technically free at the end of the novel, but she's not free from her addiction. She has nowhere to live and no way to obtain money for drugs, so she ends up becoming a prostitute that is treated brutally by the men that she works with just in order to score some more heroin. This book is just super depressing. It really is just 4 lives that are completely ruined from drug abuse, and the book is incredibly harrowing in how it portrays the decay of their lives. I would still recommend this to most people, and again, the movie adaptation is fantastic. And The Ass Saw the Angel is a 1989 novel written by Nick Cave. This is another book that I'm very interested in reading myself, so this section will be pretty short since I don't want to spoil it for myself. My reading list has grown massively since I started this series, and I hope to make a lot of smaller videos analyzing individual books on this list like I did with Ring. The name of the novel comes from a story in the Old Testament that is easily one of the most wild stories found in the Bible. It's about a man named Balaam who is riding his donkey down the road when the donkey suddenly stops because he sees an angel on the road. Balaam, however, cannot see the angel and he's frustrated, so the angel gives the donkey the power of speech so he can roast his owner. So that donkey is the ass that the title is referring to. The story, from what I have gathered, is about a mute boy who lives in a religious community where his family are shunned by the rest of the group. The mother is an abusive alcoholic and the father is obsessed with animal torture. Maybe I won't read this one after all. The book follows our main character's descent into madness, which includes horrific angelic visions and him turning against the community that he lives in. It sounds very interesting to me, and I'm for sure going to give it a read. If you haven't read this, then leave your spoiler-free comments down below. We Need to Talk About Kevin is a 2003 novel by Lionel Shriver about a woman who struggles with raising her psychopathic son. If that premise sounds interesting to you, it should. The book and movie are both really good, so I would read it if you want to experience firsthand just how much of an evil menace Kevin is. But if you want to hear me talk about Kevin, then spoilers ahead for the entire novel. Kevin is an absolute nightmare, even from birth. His mother, Eva, has struggled with him ever since he was a baby, as he only ever showed an attachment to his father, Patrick. He refused to be potty trained in order to annoy Eva, and this caused her to snap one day and break his arm. One of the tricky things with this novel is that Eva is clearly struggling, but also seems to not be in the best state mentally. And if anybody on the outside were to see a mother break the arm of her child, they would see it as abuse, and it definitely is. It's just that everyone is unable to see just how psychotic Kevin truly is. As Kevin grows into a teen, he takes an interest in archery, vandalism, and mass shooters. This is obviously a cause for concern, but Patrick insists that Eva is just being dramatic. This is also after Kevin kills his young sister's pet shrew and seemingly blinds her in one eye with drain cleaner. Like, literally her eye has to be removed and she has to have a fake one put in. He insists it was an accident, but Eva doesn't believe him. The strain on the marriage leads to Patrick and Eva deciding to get divorced. Kevin overhears this conversation and is seemingly upset by it. And I should probably talk about the framing device that this novel uses, as it's a really important part of the story that I've kept from you until now. You see, the book is written from Eva's perspective as she struggles to understand Kevin's mindset that led to him committing mass murder at his school. She regularly visits him in prison and he is just cold and indifferent. He trapped and killed 9 people with his bow, and before doing this, he also killed Patrick and his younger sister. Kevin made sure to plan this attack 3 days before his 16th birthday so he wouldn't be charged as an adult. He also used his prescription of Prozac to argue that he was experiencing a violent psychotic episode. The book ends with Kevin turning 18 and being transferred to a maximum security prison. He is frightened and scared and embraces his mother. He gives her his younger sister's prosthetic eye, which he kept as a souvenir, and Eva asks him for the first time why he committed the murders. Kevin says that he's no longer sure, and then Eva states that no matter what he did, she is still his son and she loves him. This book seriously almost got me to permanently put off the idea of having kids, because having a child like Kevin is one of my greatest fears. I do think the book is really well written, and if you're actively seeking out a video like this one, then I think you could probably handle this novel. It's an easy recommendation from me. Level 4. Boot Camp is a 2007 young adult novel by Todd Strasser about a 15-year-old boy named Garrett who is forced to attend a boot camp in upstate New York called Lake Harmony. He is sent there by his distant parents due to his lack of athleticism, staying out late, and his relationship with his former math teacher who was 8 years older than him. I'll be doing light spoilers for this one, but no specifics, so this shouldn't really spoil any of the actual plot points for you. Lake Harmony is a camp where the staff members are encouraged to use any force necessary to make the kids conform to camp behaviors. This includes a lot of physical abuse and even more psychological abuse. The story is kind of a tough read because Garrett definitely has his issues, but it's not much worse than what most teenagers go through, and to see him relentlessly abused for that is really terrible. My brother-in-law is in the Coast Guard and attended boot camp, and it seemed like pure torture from what he told me, but even at military boot camp, you aren't beaten physically by the staff, and you also have a job waiting for you at the end of it that you willingly signed up for. Lake Harmony's end goal is to beat the kids into submission so they stop being kids. I've only read some of the more brutal passages in this book, and I would say it's decently disturbing, but in a much more psychological way rather than having a lot of explicit imagery and violence. This one is definitely going on my reading list. The Cement Garden is a 1978 novel written by Ian McEwan and tells the story of a young family who lose both their parents and attempt to live on their own. This book has a lot of weird sexual stuff going on in it, including incest, and I will be giving full spoilers for this one, so be warned. This book reminded me a lot of Flowers in the Attic, which I covered in part 1 of the Iceberg, so if you enjoyed that book, then you'd probably like this one as well. There's a lot of similar subject matter, although there was less of an external threat than there was in Flowers in the Attic. The book starts with the death of the father of the family, and then about a year later, the mother dies. In order to avoid being taken to foster care, the 4 kids, being 13-year-old Jack, 17-year-old Julie, 13-year-old Sue, and 6-year-old Tom, encase their mother's corpse in cement and hide it in the cellar. As the kids start to live on their own, they are unable to keep up with the cleaning and maintenance required for the house. It grows more filthy and unsanitary throughout the entire novel. And then Jack and his older sister Julia take on kind of roles as parental figures for the family, but this leads to some uncomfortable sexual tension between the two. We are told that Jack and Julie used to play doctor with their younger sister Sue when they were younger, which sometimes led to sexual encounters among the 3 of them. When Sue starts to date an older man named Derek, Jack grows increasingly jealous and hostile towards him. Derek can smell the decaying corpse of the mother in the house and goes to investigate the cellar, where they tell him that their dog is encased in the concrete. Derek eventually deduces that it is their mother, but he doesn't reveal that he knows this. Later that night, Jack walks into Julia's room naked, but only the young Tom is in bed. Jack gets into bed with him and they start to talk about their parents. As Tom falls asleep, Julia enters the room and sees the naked Jack and then takes off all of her clothes. As the two grow more intimate, Derek enters the room and is disgusted at this. He storms out of the room and Jack and Julia begin to have sex. Derek then enters the cellar and smashes up the concrete coffin, and the book ends with the police arriving at the house to investigate the dead body. So yeah, definitely a little disturbing. This book isn't incredibly explicit, but it is a little more descriptive than something like Flowers in the Attic when it comes to incest, so I can see why it's this far down on the list. The End of Alice is a 1996 novel written by A.M. Holmes about a middle-aged pedophile and child serial killer who is serving a life sentence in prison. The book follows his correspondence from a 19-year-old girl who plans to seduce a 12-year-old boy in her neighborhood. This book is really gross, but also that's what it's going for. So if you're interested in something super creepy and grimy and gross, then this could be for you. A lot of the book is the girl describing exactly how she's grooming the boy, and the pedophile, whose name is Chappie, gives advice to her as well as just some stories from his life. I'm going to spoil what is probably the hardest part of the book to get through, so if you're interested in this, then you can go ahead and skip ahead. If you just want to hear what happens, then buckle up. We learn about the reason that Chappie is serving his life sentence. He frequently sexually assaulted and abused a 12-year-old girl that he refers to as Alice. One time he sexually assaulted her so badly that she started to bleed and complained about this to Chappie. Chappie tried to convince her that she was just starting her period, but she didn't comply, so he brutally attacked and decapitated her. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, then you should probably get some help. No, I'm just kidding. I'm also a freak like that. But if it does sound interesting, then you can give this one a read. I read through a good amount of this one, and it was pretty hard to stomach. I can handle a lot of awful protagonists, but Chappie was even testing my limits a bit. The next entry on this iceberg is called The Provocateur, but I couldn't find anything on a disturbing novel by that name. That particular title has been used for a lot of books, especially business books. So if anyone has read a disturbing novel called The Provocateur, then please let me know what it's about in the comments. But since I don't want to short you guys an entry on this iceberg, I'm going to talk about a series that I read when I was younger that unsettled me so much. This doesn't belong nearly this far down the iceberg, but I feel like nobody has read these and I want to see if anyone else has. It's a series by David Lubar that are collections of short stories, and all of them have the titles that include the word weenie in it. The first one that I read was called Invasion of the Road Weenies, but I've read almost every book in the series at this point. I first found these when I was in 3rd grade, and most of the short stories in them are kind of like goofy and fun for kids, but there are some others that really freaked me out. There's one where a kid finds a creepy genie who can grant him unlimited wishes, so the kid just wishes for all sorts of stuff. The genie then tells him that in order to grant more wishes, the kid has to enter the League of Wishmakers. The kid does this, and then the genie reveals that everything that anyone wishes for has to come from someone else, like no matter can be created or destroyed in the universe. So most of what the kid has starts to disappear until people start wishing for like his limbs and other organs. It's really weird. There's also a story about a lady who is just chilling in a hammock with her sunglasses on. A kid approaches her and she ends up turning into like a fleshy, creepy spider woman who hunts him down and then catches him in a web and presumably kills and eats him. I have a full video where I cover some of the stories from one of the novels, and I would love to do more of those videos, so if you guys are interested in that, then please let me know. I know most of you are subscribed for the disturbing stuff, but I'm also a huge fan of children's horror, as I feel that it's kind of a dying subgenre and it's really important. I'll probably do a children's horror iceberg at some point. That sounds fun to me. Journey to the End of Night is a semi-autobiographical novel written by Louis Ferdinand Céline. This book follows Ferdinand, who enlists in the French army as a medic, and a series of pretty terrible things happens to him. This book explores themes of war, hatred, isolation, medical violence, disease, drugs, and poverty. Most of the disturbing content, at least to me, comes from later in the novel, where we spend a lot of time with a doctor who is working in a slum who deals with all sorts of disease and injury, most of them being botched attempts at abortion. This book is incredibly bleak. There really is no light at the end of the tunnel for our main character. One of the reasons that I find this book so interesting in particular is that it examines a lot of massive societal systems, but it does so through the lens of one man who's only experiencing a tiny fraction of each system. This makes the book feel a lot more personal and exposes the reader to some of the worst parts of these systems that are rarely talked about. This is definitely one to read if you like historical fiction. Again, this is semi-autobiographical, but the author has admitted that like the globe-trotting aspect of the novel is exaggerated, as he spent almost all of his medical career practicing in Paris. The Girl Next Door is a 1989 horror novel by Jack Ketchum that is loosely based on the 1965 murder of Sylvia Likens. That is one of the worst true crime cases that I've ever heard of. So if you're interested in learning about the absolute worst things that humans can do to people, then I will cautiously suggest that you look into that case. This book is about 2 teenage girls who are left in the care of their abusive aunt after their parents die. The aunt grows a burning resentment for one of the girls and locks her in the basement for the neighborhood boys to abuse and torture. That's the premise of the novel, but I will be doing an in-depth summary as well, so spoilers ahead. Our 2 teenage girls, Meg and Susan, are sent to live with their Aunt Ruth, who is a single mother to 3 sons, Willie, Donnie, and Ralph. She is also an abusive alcoholic that befriends a group of neighborhood boys by letting them come freely into her house and play rough. She also lets them drink beer occasionally. One of the teenage boys in the neighborhood, David, has a crush on Meg. Soon after Meg moves into Ruth's house, Ruth starts to verbally abuse her. At one point, Ralph touches Meg's breast and she hits him. And then Ruth beats Susan for sticking up for Meg. Meg tries to tell the police about this, but Ruth locks her in a bomb shelter. This begins the extended torture of Meg. She is stripped, bound, and gagged by her 3 male cousins and is starved constantly. Ruth allows the other neighborhood boys to beat Meg when they feel like it. They burn her with cigarettes and lighters, and some of the boys even urinate on her. Susan attempts to break Meg free from the cellar, but she is caught by Ruth. And as a punishment for this, Ruth allows her son Donnie to sexually assault her. His brother Willie also wants to join in, but Ruth doesn't allow this because she sees it as incest for him to sexually assault her just after her brother did. Keep in mind that Donnie is already Meg's cousin, so they already crossed that bridge. After this, Ruth carves the words I F me into Meg's stomach and then forcibly mutilates her genitals. Meg dies shortly after this. David then alerts the police, who show up to arrest Ruth, but before they can, David pushes Ruth down the stairs and kills her. The officers sees this and decides not to arrest David as they saw it as justifiable homicide. The book ends with the now adult David learning about a brutal crime spree that was committed by one of Ruth's now adult children. So yeah, very dark and disturbing and very close to the real life case that inspired it. Read this at your own peril. Level 5. No Sanctuary is a novel by Richard Lehman about a whole bunch of different plot threads. We have a couple who goes camping in the woods. At the same time, we have a woman who likes to break into people's houses and just kind of hang out there. The issue is that the house that she broke into is owned by a serial killer who likes to kidnap women and take them into the wilderness. And the book is kind of about all of these different plot threads. There's a bunch of other ones as well, kind of converging. And the book goes to some pretty dark places. Obviously, with any novel about a serial killer, you're going to get disturbing content. But the serial killer in this book is particularly depraved. We have a lot of torture, sexual violence, and murder. Something that is interesting about this book is that the novel just keeps adding more plot threads, like I said. We have two storylines that seem to start very separate from each other and are kind of separate for a large part of the novel. Our couple who goes camping run into a group of dudes who are aggressive and creepy, and the whole book kind of has you waiting for the other shoe to drop. In that way, it's a fun novel because it feels so chaotic to the point where the only satisfying payoff can be all of the stories converging, but you also don't really want that to happen because it'll most likely result in a lot of death and carnage to characters that are decently fleshed out. Enough for me to care about them, at least. This book is definitely intense, but it isn't quite at the level where it leaves you feeling completely empty and depressed at the end of it. The author is trying to create a fun, disturbing story, and I think he does a good job of that. Ekus is a 1973 play written by Peter Schaefer. I think it may have been inspired by a novel, but I wasn't able to confirm that. It's about a child psychiatrist who attempts to treat a 17-year-old boy who has some sort of strange religious fascination with horses. We're doing full spoilers for this one, so skip ahead if you're interested in seeing this play, I guess. I don't think it's currently showing anywhere, so this synopsis might be the best you're going to get beyond like reading the script. Martin Dysart is a child psychiatrist who seems somewhat unfulfilled by his career. He is constantly treating teenagers that return to dull, uninspired lives where they have nothing to believe in. He is ordered to take on the case of Alan, a 17-year-old boy who has a weird fixation with horses. Dysart explains a dream that he once had about being a public official presiding over a mass ritual sacrifice of children. He slices open the stomachs of hundreds of children and pulls out their entrails. In the dream, he fears that he will be sacrificed in the same way since he is a non-believer. We learn that Alan has a particularly strong fixation on the more violent aspects of the Bible. He tears down and destroys a picture of the crucifixion at the foot of his bed and replaces it with one of a horse staring at him. From a young age, he was fascinated with horses and grew a sexual fixation on them. That can't be good. Alan starts to work at a horse stable and he is a model employee. It becomes clear to Dysart that he is erotically fixated on one of the horses, who he sneaks out of the stable at night and rides naked every night. Rides like in the normal human way that a human rides a horse. Nothing that gross, fortunately. The second act of the play sees a girl named Jill take an interest in Alan and try to seduce him. She takes him to an adult movie theater where he runs into his own dad, leaving him traumatized. Jill then takes him to the stables, and the two try to have sex, but Alan is unable to. He screams at her to get out and begs the horses for their forgiveness. Alan's favorite horse then shouts at him in Dysart's voice that he is a jealous god and that Alan is his. He screams at him that God sees him, and Alan, frightened and insane at this point, uses a steel stake to blind the 6 horses in the stable since they have seen his soul. The play ends with Dysart stating that his treatment of Alan will make him normal, but he isn't sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. And listen, I am no child psychiatrist, but I don't know if I would say that Alan in his current state is really anything to be mourned, but maybe that's just me though. So yeah, definitely a weird play, with that one dream sequence being the most disturbing part for me. I was honestly quite shocked that the novel didn't end in like a Mr. Hand situation. If you don't know what that is, then don't look it up. It'll just make your life worse. Out is a Japanese crime novel written by Natsuo Kirino and follows 4 young women who work the graveyard shift at the same factory. All of the women live pretty terrible lives. Some of them are in gambling debt and have to fight off loan sharks. Others live with abusive family members. The book is pretty disturbing in the violence that happens both to and by these women. There's a pretty detailed description of the dismemberment of a corpse that is probably the most disturbing part of the novel. If you're interested in Japanese literature, then this is definitely one that you should check out. The book also has a film adaptation that I personally had never heard of. I typically like J-horror films, so maybe I'll have to check this one out. If you've seen it, then please let me know what you thought in the comments below. Beloved is going to be another cop-out entry for me because this book sounds awesome and I don't want to spoil it for myself. I seriously have to give props for the creator of this Iceberg. While the placements of some of these can be a little off and weird at times, all of the novels seem very interesting to me. This book is about a family of newly freed slaves just after the Civil War in America. The family is dysfunctional, which is already enough to deal with, but things get even worse when a malevolent spirit shows up on the front steps of the house that calls herself Beloved. Doesn't that just sound like an awesome premise for a novel? I'm a huge fan of haunted house stories, and even more so when the spirits seem to have interesting lore and mythology to them. If you read this, then please let me know what you thought in the comments below. It's going on my to-read list for sure. Such Nice People is a novel written by Sandra Scoppertone. It's kind of a Christmas novel about a family where everyone is on the verge of doing something terrible. Most of the story follows one of the boys as he plans to murder his entire family at the behest of a bizarre alien-like creature that he is hallucinating. I've read the first couple chapters of this and it seems pretty good. It's a very slow burn, so if you're into these kind of books for the explosive action and carnage, then this one probably won't be for you. Easily the grossest part of this novel involves a plunger. I'm going to spoil this now, but it's literally in the first couple chapters. Our character that sees hallucinations goes out to the shed and his siblings look in and spy at him. He seems to be talking to something that no one can see. He then takes off his clothes and starts to pleasure himself furiously, and then he takes an old wooden plunger and shoves it up inside of himself. That's probably the most obscene thing that happens in the novel, but there is a lot of violence, particularly at the end. So if you like slow burns and weird religious hallucinations and stories where everyone is losing their minds, then this one might be for you. I did manage to find a PDF of this one online if you're curious. I am guilty of reading a lot of free PDFs, but I almost always buy the novel from the author afterwards, either digitally or a physical copy to support them. Last Exit to Brooklyn is a 1964 novel written by Hubert Selby Jr. that details the state of lower-class Brooklyn and New York in the 1950s. The book is notable for taking a completely uncompromised view of what life was like then and not shying away from all the horrible things that happened in that area of the United States. I won't be spoiling this fully. The book contains 6 smaller stories, and I'll go through and give a quick overview of them so you can see if they're interesting. Again, no major spoilers here. Another Day, Another Dollar is about a gang of Brooklyn hoodlums that get into a violent fight with some army soldiers on leave. The Queen is Dead is about a transgender sex worker that is treated poorly by her homophobic brother. And Baby Makes 3 is the story of a family that has a baby out of wedlock. Tra-La-La is about another sex worker who is brutally sexually assaulted by a group of men. This is probably the most disturbing scene in the book. Strike is about a closeted gay man that abuses his wife and goes on strike with the union that he works in. There is a scene of sexual assault and pedophilia in this one, so be warned. And lastly, Land's End, which follows the lives of a number of ordinary people in Brooklyn. This one certainly seems interesting to me, and it was widely praised on release for how it didn't pull any of its punches. I don't know if this is my thing exactly, but I'm sure a lot of you guys could find enjoyment in this. Level 6. All right, last level. You know the drill. Some nasty stuff is coming, so if you want to retain what's left of your innocence, then go watch my video about Ring. Let's do this. Tiger Tiger is a memoir written by Margot Fragazzo about her experience being sexually abused by a man that she met when he was 51 and she was 7. The abuse carried on for 15 years until he ended his own life. This book is rough, easily one of the worst that I've covered. There are a lot of graphic scenes of sexual assault, and the girl has been groomed so aggressively by this monster that she willingly hides the relationship from her family, friends, and social workers. Seriously, this is not a book to read if you can't handle this kind of stuff. It's awful. What makes this worse is that it's the true story of the author. She lived through all of this. Although I guess there also is an aspect of kind of her reclaiming these horrific events for herself in order to educate others on what she went through. So it kind of belongs in this odd category of novels that are completely depraved and disturbing and will make you want to take a shower afterwards, but are also meaningful and have a message to send to the world that is ultimately somewhat positive. So what I'm saying is that this isn't a novel that you should tell everyone about, but if someone catches you reading it, you can claim to not be a total degenerate. In the Miso Soup is a novel by Ryo Murakami. It is about a 20-year-old man who escorts men around to different sex clubs in Tokyo. He is hired by a strange American man with seemingly plastic skin to escort him around for 3 days in a row. Our main character suspects that this man is a local serial killer that is currently on a killing spree. I couldn't find a whole ton of information on this novel, but from what I've read, it seems like a good mystery novel with an absolutely depraved antagonist. The things this guy does to people are really terrible, and the idea of him being a tourist serial killer is definitely intriguing. I've always had kind of a strange fascination with stories where a serial killer arrives from another country or place. I think there's always this idea that most serial killers are outsiders who hide in plain sight, but when you are a visible outsider, it adds another interesting dimension to evading capture. Maynard's House by Herman Rocher, or Rocher if it's French, is a novel that seems to be this far down due to its obscurity, as it doesn't have to do with anything that is particularly outrageous or disturbing. It follows a Vietnam War veteran who inherits a house that he ends up trapped in during a particularly bad winter. On top of that, the house is a historical site where a woman accused of witchcraft was killed during the Salem witch trials. Our main character grows more paranoid throughout the winter and experiences strange hauntings in the isolated cabin that could all just be the result of PTSD and cabin fever. So this one doesn't seem too disturbing, but it sounds like an interesting read, and you guys know the drill. If you've read this, then leave what you thought about it in the comments down below. I've noticed that a lot of books on this last tier are kind of hit or miss, so sorry if I can't always give a detailed description of some of these. I would love to read most of these someday and give each one of them an individual video, so I'll probably start working on that when the Iceberg series is done. I also want to branch out with other horror content like movies and video games if people are interested. Anything with creepy lore, really. The Songs of Maldoror is a French poetic novel written by Comte de Lautremont and published in 1868. Sorry, it's my high school French creeping in there. The book is a surrealist work featuring the musings of an evil, demonic figure named Maldoror. I've only read like a little bit of this thing, but it just feels evil. Most of it is Maldoror who either participates in terrible deeds or watches on them and comments on them. A lot of the imagery is just unsettling and odd. We have an entire chapter about a man being bit by a tarantula while he sleeps. At one point, Maldoror has sex with a shark, so that's cool, I guess. There's also an account of Maldoror essentially seducing a dude before he throws him into a sack and beats his body against a bridge, killing him. It's all very strange and surreal and probably has a lot of very deep meanings that I don't have the time to get into right now, but if you're looking for non-conventional narratives that will weird you out, then this is definitely one of them. I get really creeped out when reading something that isn't presented in the typical way that a novel or movie would be. I think that's why House of Leaves creeped me out so much and why Skinamarink almost made me pee my pants, even though nothing happens in that movie. The Consumer is a collection of short stories by Michael Gira about some people committing horrible, awful acts. Some light spoilers ahead. I won't be covering the actual narrative, just the shocking content found inside. As a nice warm-up before we get into the terrible stuff, we have a first chapter all about incest. So if that's the starting point here, then I don't know if I'm gonna like where we're gonna end up. Next, we have two dudes who take a bunch of drugs and hang out in a sewer pipe. There is some pretty nasty animal abuse towards a dog. The third chapter is very explicit. It's a detailed description of a guy sexually abusing his daughter. Next, we have a guy whose wife dies, and in order to feel close to her, he eats her dead body, which is honestly a nice break from what came before. I guess that's the bar we're setting for ourselves now. We have the torture of a mute man, the group sexual assault of children, a man who hires a guy to torture him, a lot more sexual assault and murder, and a ton of gross drug use and sex. This novel felt kind of like Proxy to me. It's not really well written, and it's just a lot of what seems like graphic fantasies. Read this if you want to ruin your life. The Obscene Bird of Night is the last novel on this list and is a highly acclaimed novel by José Donoso. This book is one with less of a narrative and more so a way to examine themes of life and death. The book uses the myth of the Mbunche, which is an ape-like creature that is disfigured and has been sutured, wrapped, and bound from birth with all of its orifices sewn shut and its sexual organs bound. It then acts as like a guardian to a cave. This myth explores the idea of completely isolating somebody from the outside world and all human experiences and postulates kind of what horrible creature would turn into. That's the myth that the book is based on, but most of the novel is musing on this principle rather than any defined narrative explicitly about that myth. It definitely doesn't seem too disturbing to me, but it's definitely something that I've never once heard of, so it's definitely obscure. I would be shocked if anyone watching this has read this thing, but if you have, then please let us know what we're all missing out on. And that is it for part 3. Thank you guys so much for watching. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already. These videos are a ton of fun to make, and I'm so grateful you guys enjoy hearing me talk about this stuff. I want to take a moment to shout out my wonderful channel members who got early access to this video, as well as all other videos on this channel, and will be receiving exclusive videos as well. You can become a member for just $3 a month, which helps this channel grow. It really does make my day to see new channel members. Thank you to all my members that you are seeing on the screen right now, and a special thank you to all my gold tier members, those being Amanda Mapes, Chris Lamb, Lucas Fernando, and a last mysterious member with no name, but you seem to have a picture of a spiky slug-like creature for their profile image, so thank you, Spiky Slug. Thank you to all my members that you're seeing on the screen right now, and a special thank you to all my gold tier members, Amanda Mapes, Chris Lamb, Lucas Fernando, and a last mysterious member with no name, but seems to have a picture of a spiky slug for their profile image, so thank you, Spiky Slug. Thank you once again for watching. It really does mean a lot to me that you guys watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. See ya.